September 15, 1944, just before midnight near the Luxembourg border. Technical Sergeant Harold Dahl crouched in a muddy foxhole, adjusting the volume knobs on a device that looked nothing like standard military equipment. Around him, the autumn mist rolled across empty fields where, by all appearances, an entire armored division was preparing for a major offensive. The sounds were unmistakable. The distinctive rumble of Sherman tank engines warming up, the metallic clanking of treads on hardened ground, the shouted commands of officers organizing their units for movement. German reconnaissance teams hidden in the tree line 300 meters away were undoubtedly recording every sound, every detail, every piece of intelligence that confirmed what their commanders already suspected. What those German observers didn't know was that they were listening to the greatest audio illusion in military history, and that the armored division they were reporting existed only on magnetic tape and in the imagination of one former sound effects engineer from Hollywood. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit composed of artists, engineers and designers, used nothing more than recorded sound inflatable tanks and theatrical props to deceive the German military leadership so thoroughly that 10 full divisions were held in reserve, waiting for an attack that would never come, while the real Allied forces struck elsewhere with devastating effect. Harold Dahl had spent the years before the conflict designing sound effects for radio dramas in New York City. He knew how to make a creaking door sound ominous, how to simulate a rainstorm with nothing but a piece of canvas and some dried peas, how to create the illusion of an entire city street using just a handful of props and clever audio layering. When military recruiters came looking for men with unusual skills in early 1943, Dahl thought they were joking. He remembered the recruiting officer, a captain named Morrison, looking at his resume with genuine interest. Morrison had said, leaning back in his chair, "So you're telling me you can make 12 people sound like 100? Dahl had nodded, still uncertain where this conversation was leading. "With the right equipment and proper acoustic understanding, yes, sir. I've done crowd scenes for radio programs with just 6 actors and some clever microphone placement." "What about tanks?" Morrison had asked, his expression completely serious now. "Could you make 10 inflatable decoys sound like an entire armored battalion?" That conversation had led Dahl here, to this foxhole in Luxembourg, where he was conducting an orchestra of deception that would have made his radio drama colleagues laugh with disbelief. Except this performance had stakes that no radio show could match. Every sound had to be perfect, every detail authentic enough to convince trained military observers that they were witnessing genuine preparations for a massive offensive. The equipment Dahl worked with would have seemed absurd in any other context. The military had provided him with dozens of massive speakers, each weighing over 50 pounds, powered by generators that had to be carefully positioned to avoid detection. The recordings themselves had been made at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where engineers had spent weeks capturing every possible sound of armored and infantry operations. They had recorded tanks starting up, idling, moving at various speeds across different terrain. They had recorded the sounds of supply trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, and even the specific acoustic signature of different artillery pieces being moved into position. But the genius wasn't just in the recordings themselves. It was in understanding how sound traveled across different landscapes, how weather affected acoustic propagation, how to layer multiple sounds to create the 3-dimensional audio impression of a vast military operation. Dahl had learned that sound could be a weapon as powerful as any artillery shell, if wielded with sufficient skill and understanding. Corporal James Fletcher, a former theater set designer from Chicago, worked alongside Dahl on this operation. While Dahl managed the sonic illusion, Fletcher oversaw the visual component. Hundreds of inflatable tanks, trucks and artillery pieces that from a distance or from aerial reconnaissance looked remarkably convincing. These rubber decoys could be inflated in minutes and positioned to suggest a massive buildup of forces. Fletcher had explained to new unit members, his hands gesturing enthusiastically, "The Germans have excellent reconnaissance. They're not stupid. So we have to give them every reason to believe what they're seeing and hearing is real. That means coordinating sound, visual elements, radio traffic, even staged movement patterns that match how real units would behave. The operation near Luxembourg was designated Operation Bettembourg, though that name would remain classified for decades. The objective was simple but audacious: convince the German military leadership that the American forces were preparing to strike across the Luxembourg border with overwhelming force, causing them to reinforce that sector, with divisions pulled from other areas where the real offensive would occur. Dahl checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. Time to begin the evening program. He signaled to Private Eddie Romano, a former radio technician from New Jersey, who manned the second speaker array positioned 400 meters to the north. Romano's job was to create the impression of vehicle movement between positions, using carefully timed audio cues that suggested tanks were being repositioned under cover of darkness. The first sounds Dahl introduced were subtle: the distant murmur of engines idling, the occasional clank of equipment, not too much, not too obvious. German intelligence officers were trained to be suspicious of things that seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. The deception had to unfold gradually, like a story revealing itself piece by piece. Lieutenant Frank Simmons, the officer overseeing this particular operation, moved between positions in a crouched run. Simmons had been an advertising executive before the conflict, and he understood psychology, understood how to build a narrative that would lead the target audience to the conclusion you wanted them to reach. He stopped next to Dahl's position. Simmons said quietly, "How's it sounding from here?" Dahl listened carefully to his own audio mix, comparing it to what he knew German observers would be hearing from their positions. "Good, sir. We're building it slowly. Right now they're hearing what sounds like routine maintenance and preparation. In about 20 minutes, I'll introduce the sounds of heavier equipment being moved. By 0200 hours, they should be convinced that major movements are underway." "What about the acoustic analysis equipment we know they have?" Simmons asked. This was a legitimate concern. German technical intelligence had sophisticated equipment for analyzing sound recordings, trying to distinguish real military activity from potential deceptions. Dahl smiled in the darkness. "That's why we're using the actual recordings, sir. These aren't simulations or approximations. These are real Sherman tanks, real supply trucks, real artillery pieces recorded at Fort Knox. Their analysis will confirm these are authentic American military sounds. They just won't know the sounds were recorded 3 months ago and 4,000 miles away." This attention to technical authenticity was what separated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops from simple trickery. Every element of their deceptions was grounded in reality, using actual equipment and actual sounds, just deployed in unexpected ways. They weren't creating fantasies, they were reorganizing reality to tell a different story. As midnight passed and the operation progressed, Dahl gradually increased the complexity of the audio landscape. Now the sound suggested not just idling vehicles but actual movement, the deep rumble of diesel engines under load, the characteristic squeak and clatter of tank treads, the backup beepers of heavy equipment, the shouted commands that would accompany such operations, played through additional speakers at carefully calculated volume levels. Meanwhile, Fletcher's visual deception team was working frantically in the darkness, using the cover of night to reposition their inflatable decoys, creating track marks in the mud that would be visible to aerial reconnaissance at dawn. They even had soldiers walk patterns through the area carrying heavy equipment, creating footpaths and movement patterns that matched what would be expected from a real military buildup. The most innovative aspect of the deception, however, was the signal's intelligence component. Technicians were broadcasting fake radio traffic using authentic military communication protocols and codes, creating the electromagnetic signature of an entire division headquarters, coordinating the movements of multiple battalions. German signals intelligence units would intercept these transmissions and add them to the growing pile of evidence that something major was being prepared in the Luxembourg sector. What made this particular operation especially critical was its timing. The real Allied offensive was being prepared to the north in a completely different sector. Every German division that remained focused on Luxembourg, every reserve unit held back to counter the phantom threat that Dahl and his colleagues were creating, was a division that wouldn't be available to oppose the actual attack. The strategic mathematics were ruthlessly simple. If this deception held 10 German divisions in place for even 3 days, the advantage to the real offensive would be incalculable. Technical Sergeant Walter Arnett, who had been a violinist with the Philadelphia Orchestra before being drafted, stood watch on the perimeter. His role had nothing to do with his musical background and everything to do with his sharp hearing. Arnett's job was to listen for any actual German patrol activity, any sign that they might be attempting to get close enough to discover the deception. So far, the night had been quiet, except for the carefully orchestrated sounds of their fake military build-up. Arnett whispered to his companion, a young private named Cole. "You ever think about how strange this is? We're out here making noise instead of trying to be quiet. Goes against everything they taught us in basic training." Cole, who couldn't have been more than 19 years old, grinned in the darkness. "My dad worked in a carnival before the Depression. He used to say the best trick was always hiding the truth in plain sight. Make something so obvious that people don't question it." That folk wisdom captured something essential about the 23rd's approach to deception. They didn't try to hide. They performed loudly and confidently, understanding that human psychology often accepts bold assertions more readily than subtle suggestions. As the night progressed, Dahl's audio program entered its most intensive phase. Now the sounds suggested a major movement operation. Multiple tank columns, supply convoys, artillery pieces being towed into position. The volume levels were carefully calculated to be audible at German observation posts without being so loud as to seem unnatural or suspicious. Every few minutes, Dahl would pause the recordings briefly, creating natural breaks in the activity that matched how real operations would unfold, with pauses for regrouping, communication, and coordination. Lieutenant Simmons received a radio report from one of the forward observation teams. A German patrol had been spotted about 800 meters away, moving along a ridgeline that offered an excellent vantage point of the entire area. This was exactly what they wanted. The patrol would report back what they saw and heard, providing first-hand intelligence that would corroborate the other evidence being gathered by German reconnaissance. Simmons said into his radio, "All units, maintain program. We have observers. This is what we're here for." The pressure on Dahl intensified. Now, it wasn't just about running the audio program according to plan. Every sound had to be perfect, had to reinforce the illusion without any detail that might trigger suspicion. He adjusted the balance between his speaker arrays, creating subtle variations in volume that suggested tanks at different distances, moving at slightly different speeds, exactly as a real armored column would move across this terrain. The technical challenges were immense. Sound doesn't travel in straight lines. It reflects off hills, gets absorbed by trees, bends around obstacles, behaves differently in different weather conditions. Dahl had to account for all of these factors, positioning his speakers and timing his playback so that the acoustic picture presented to German observers would be convincing from their specific locations. It was like conducting a symphony, where the audience was several football fields away and actively hostile to your performance. By 0200 hours, the operation had been running for over 2 hours. Fletcher's team had completed their visual preparations. Now, as dawn approached, German aerial reconnaissance would photograph what appeared to be an entire armored division, complete with tank formations, supply depots, command posts, and all the infrastructure necessary to support a major offensive operation. The photographs would match the sound intelligence. The signals intelligence would match both. Every piece of the puzzle would fit together, telling a story that was completely fabricated but entirely convincing. Staff Sergeant Maurice Klein, who had been an architect in civilian life, was responsible for what the unit called atmosphere. His job was to add the small details that made the deception believable at a human level. He had soldiers light cooking fires at appropriate times. He had them string laundry lines between the inflatable vehicles. He positioned dummy soldiers in realistic poses, visible to distant observation, but never close enough for detailed inspection. Klein understood that military installations had a lived-in quality, a messiness and randomness that pure mechanical precision would lack. Klein had explained his philosophy to newcomers. The Germans are looking for patterns for things that don't fit, so we have to give them the imperfections they expect, Real soldiers would have laundry drying. Real tank crews would heat coffee. Real military operations are never perfectly organized. We make it deliberately imperfect in exactly the ways that real operations are imperfect. This psychological sophistication was what made the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops so effective. They weren't just technical specialists. They were artists who understood narrative, who understood how humans construct reality from fragments of evidence, who understood that the most convincing lies are built on foundations of truth. As dawn broke on September 16th, Dahl finally powered down his equipment. The night program was complete. Now the visual elements would carry the deception forward through the daylight hours, while his team rested and prepared for another performance the following night. He was exhausted, his hands cramping from hours of precise control adjustments, his ears ringing from monitoring audio levels through headphones. Captain Roy Eichel, the unit's operations officer, gathered the team for a brief assessment. Eichel had been a professor of psychology at Yale before the conflict, and he brought an academic rigor to their deception planning that complemented the artistic creativity of the other team members. Eichel said, his voice showing fatigue but satisfaction, "Initial reports suggest the Germans bought it completely. Signal intercepts show they're moving reserve units toward this sector. Aerial reconnaissance confirms their observation posts are active and focused on our position. We'll maintain the operation for another 48 hours, then begin our withdrawal program." The withdrawal would be as carefully choreographed as the build-up. They couldn't simply vanish, which would immediately reveal the deception. Instead, they would gradually reduce the audio activity, simulate a division moving back for regrouping, create the impression of a postponed offensive. This would keep German attention focused on the area even after the 23rd had moved on to their next assignment. What Dahl and his colleagues didn't know at the time, what couldn't be confirmed until after the conflict ended and intelligence archives were examined, was just how successful their operation had been. German military records captured and analyzed in the years following the conflict showed that 10 full divisions, approximately 150,000 soldiers with supporting equipment and logistics, had been held in reserve or repositioned to counter the perceived threat in the Luxembourg sector. Those 10 divisions represented enormous combat power. They included armored units, infantry divisions, and artillery regiments that would have significantly altered the balance of forces if they had been deployed to oppose the real Allied offensive. Instead, they sat waiting for an attack that existed only in the minds of German commanders, convinced by evidence that was perfectly authentic in every detail except the most important one. None of it was happening in real time. The strategic impact was profound. When the actual Allied offensive began 3 days later, it encountered lighter resistance than anticipated in the crucial opening phase. German reserves that might have been rushed to contain the breakthrough were instead positioned to counter the phantom threat in Luxembourg. By the time German intelligence realized they had been deceived, the real offensive had already achieved its initial objectives, and the tactical situation had fundamentally shifted. Technical Sergeant Harold Dahl would participate in over 20 similar operations before the conflict in Europe ended. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops conducted deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and eventually into Germany itself. They are credited with saving an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives through their deceptions, forcing German commanders to make strategic decisions based on false information, spreading confusion and uncertainty throughout the opposing command structure. The scale of their operations grew progressively more ambitious. Later deceptions involved simulating entire army corps, not just divisions. They coordinated with resistance networks to plant false documents that would be discovered by German intelligence. They staged elaborate ruses involving captured equipment and double agents. Always, the foundation was the same: meticulous attention to authentic detail, psychological sophistication about how humans process evidence, and the creative audacity to attempt deceptions that seemed impossibly bold. What makes their story particularly remarkable is how few people were involved. The entire 23rd Headquarters Special Troops numbered only about 1,100 soldiers at its peak strength. Yet this relatively small unit consistently convinced German intelligence that they were observing forces 10 to 20 times larger. The multiplication of force through deception, the ability to make 1,000 soldiers appear to be 10,000, represented a revolution in military thinking. After the conflict ended, Dahl returned to New York and continued working in sound engineering, though he never forgot those nights in Luxembourg and dozens of other locations across Europe. For decades, the operations of the 23rd remained classified. The soldiers who served in the unit were forbidden from discussing their work, bound by secrecy agreements that outlasted the conflict by 25 years. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that the full story began to emerge. Historians gained access to declassified records. Veterans of the unit, now elderly, were finally permitted to share their experiences. What they revealed was a story that seemed almost too creative to believe. Artists and engineers who went to the front lines armed with inflatable tanks, recorded sounds and theatrical props, who fought with illusions instead of explosives, who saved lives through deception rather than direct action. The technical innovations pioneered by the 23rd had lasting impact beyond the immediate tactical successes. The concept of acoustic deception, of using recorded sound as a weapon, influenced military thinking about information warfare and psychological operations for generations. The understanding that human perception could be systematically manipulated through carefully constructed evidence packages became a foundation for later developments in military deception doctrine. Dahl himself rarely spoke about his service, even after the declassification. When he did discuss it, usually with other veterans of the unit at their occasional reunions, he focused on the technical challenges and the creative problem-solving, not on the strategic importance or the lives saved. For him, it had been a job that required precision and creativity, skills he had developed in radio studios that found unexpected application in a completely different context. One story Dahl did share, late in his life during an interview for a documentary about the 23rd, captured the strange mixture of artistry and mortal stakes that defined their work. During one operation in France, a German artillery position had begun ranging shots toward their position, apparently responding to the sounds of the fake tank division. The unit had to maintain their deception even as shells were landing nearby, because breaking cover would reveal the truth and compromise the entire operation. Dahl had recalled, his hands still steady as he described events decades past. "I remember thinking, this is insane. I'm sitting in a hole playing recordings of tank engines while real artillery is trying to destroy tanks that don't exist. But we couldn't stop. The whole operation depended on the Germans believing we had an armored force in that location, so we kept playing the tapes, kept running the program, while the shells came in. Fortunately, they were aiming at where they thought the tanks were, not where we actually were with our speakers." That anecdote, with its mixture of absurdity and genuine danger, epitomized the unique nature of the 23rd's operations. They were performing, creating theater, engaging in what was essentially an elaborate magic trick. But the consequences of their performance were measured in strategic advantages and lives preserved, in divisions mispositioned and reserves committed to counter threats that vanished like smoke. The German military leadership, proud of their tactical and strategic sophistication, had been systematically deceived by artists armed with rubber and recordings. The irony was profound. All their technical analysis, all their intelligence gathering, all their careful observation had been defeated not by superior military force, but by creative thinking and an understanding of human perception. Post-conflict analysis revealed that German intelligence had actually suspected deception operations were occurring, but they could never reliably determine which evidence was real and which was fabricated. The 23rd was so skilled at creating authentic-seeming operations that German commanders couldn't risk ignoring any potential threat, even when they suspected it might be false. This uncertainty, this inability to distinguish real from fake, became its own kind of weapon, paralyzing decision-making and forcing conservative defensive postures. The story of Technical Sergeant Harold Dahl and the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops represents something larger than just a clever tactical deception. It demonstrates how creativity, imagination, and psychological insight can be as powerful as traditional military strength. It shows how a small group of specialists thinking differently about problems can have strategic impact far beyond their numbers. It reveals how the conflicts of the mid-20th century were fought not just with tanks and aircraft, but with information, perception, and the systematic manipulation of belief. The lessons learned from the 23rd influenced military doctrine for decades. The concept that deception could be a force multiplier, that making the opponent believe false information could be as valuable as destroying their actual forces, became central to military thinking. The techniques pioneered by Dahl and his colleagues, updated with modern technology, continue to inform how militaries think about information operations and perception management. Perhaps most remarkably, the 23rd achieved all this without causing unnecessary harm. Their weapon was illusion, not violence. They won by making the opponent believe something false, not by direct confrontation. In conflicts often remembered for their destructive scale, the story of the Ghost Army, as they came to be known, offers a different model: victory through creativity, impact through imagination, strategic success through the systematic deployment of doubt and deception. The 10 German divisions held in reserve near Luxembourg, waiting for an attack that never came, represent one of the most successful deception operations in military history. Those divisions, over 100,000 soldiers with all their equipment and supporting logistics, were effectively removed from the conflict for critical days during a decisive period, not through direct engagement, but through the careful application of recorded sound, inflatable props, and creative thinking, by 1,000 artists and engineers who understood that reality is, in many ways, a collective agreement that can be systematically challenged. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.